Hello dear friends, welcome to my channel. Today I am going to share with you one of the most surprising and emotional truths from history, a story of war, loyalty, and survival. Before we begin, make sure you hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon so you never miss any of these incredible stories from the past. Now, let's step back in time to the early 19th century, when empires were colliding and the fate of nations rested not only on the shoulders of men, but also on the strength and loyalty of animals. This is the story of Napoleon's Arabian horse, the magnificent creature who carried his master through glory, defeat, and finally survived one of history's greatest catastrophes, the retreat from Moscow in 1812. Long before Moscow's frozen streets were littered with the bones of men and beasts, there was a young general rising in Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte, ambitious and tireless, understood the importance of horses better than most. A commander was nothing without his steed, for in those days the horse was more than transport. It was a partner in battle, a symbol of power, a living extension of its rider's will. Among his many mounts, there was one that stood apart, one that would enter legend, an Arabian stallion, small yet sturdy, elegant yet fierce, carrying with him the pride of a breed that had roamed deserts for centuries. This horse, brought from the east, had the fiery spirit of Arabia and the endurance of a creature born for long marches. His coat gleamed white in the sunlight, though some said it was more of a silver sheen, like moonlight trapped in flesh. His large dark eyes held a depth that soldiers whispered about, as if the horse could understand the chaos of men. When Napoleon rode this Arabian, he felt invincible. Together they cut across Europe, Austria, Prussia, Spain, the horse never faltering, never breaking. Where others stumbled, this Arabian endured, carrying his master through the thunder of cannons, the crash of sabers, and the smoke of gunpowder. The bond between man and horse was not one of mere utility. Napoleon trusted this stallion more than many of his generals. On nights before battles, the horse would be groomed with care, his mane brushed, his saddle checked, his hooves cleaned, for this was not simply an animal of war, but a symbol of destiny. Soldiers would often gather to watch as the emperor mounted his Arabian, and a hush would fall over them, as though they were witnessing not just a general riding to war, but fate itself moving forward. By 1812, Napoleon's empire stretched wide, but his ambition stretched wider still. His eyes turned eastward toward the vast Russian lands. The Tsar had defied him, trade was slipping, and pride was at stake. So the Grande Armée, the greatest force Europe had ever seen, was assembled. Over 600,000 men, countless wagons, artillery, and more horses than the fields could feed. Among these multitudes was the Arabian, chosen to accompany Napoleon on the campaign that was meant to secure eternal glory. The march began in summer, across the wide plains of Poland and into Russia's endless fields. At first the land was generous, green meadows, rivers flowing, villages dotting the countryside. The Arabian carried Napoleon with ease, prancing proudly at the head of columns that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The soldiers cheered when they saw their emperor in the saddle, his small but proud mount gleaming with sweat and light, seeming almost supernatural in its endurance. Yet Russia was not a land that welcomed invaders. Villages were burned ahead of the advancing army, fields stripped bare by retreating peasants. The further Napoleon pressed, the more barren the land became. Supplies grew scarce, men began to suffer, horses fell by the thousands. Still, the Arabian endured, carrying his master across dusty roads, through smoke-filled skies, past the abandoned towns that smelled of ashes and sorrow. By September, the Grande Armée reached Moscow, but victory was hollow. The city burned as they entered, set aflame by its own people rather than handed over to the invader. The Arabian pawed the ground uneasily as flames consumed wooden houses, the night sky glowing red. Napoleon sat on his back in silence, staring at a prize that offered no shelter, no food, no triumph. Winter was coming, and the horse seemed to sense what men refused to admit. It is said that animals know the truth of nature before men do. The Arabian, restless in his stables, whinnied at the frost that crept across the ground, as if warning that the heart of Russia would not yield easily. But Napoleon, stubborn and proud, lingered too long. When the retreat finally began, it was already too late. The snow fell heavy, the winds howled like wolves, and the Grande Armée began its march back across the wasteland it had created. The Arabian now became more than a mount. He became Napoleon's lifeline. Through blizzards that blinded men, across rivers frozen with treachery, through villages filled with starving shadows, this horse pressed on. His breath steamed in the icy air, his flanks shivered with cold, yet he never faltered. Men collapsed in the snow, artillery was abandoned, wagons shattered, but the Arabian bore the emperor forward. Soldiers who could still lift their heads took courage when they saw the silver-coated stallion still moving, still carrying hope upon his back. What followed was a march through hell, a nightmare written in frost and blood. But the Arabian survived, carrying his master out of Russia when hundreds of thousands did not. He returned to France thinner, scarred, yet still alive, a living witness to the folly of empires and the endurance of loyalty. And so, my dear friends, this is how the legend of Napoleon's Arabian horse began, not in triumph but in survival. Snow fell like ash from a ruined sky. The once proud Grande Armée, which had marched into Russia with banners flying and drums beating, now dragged itself westward in a slow, broken column. Men no longer marched in step. They stumbled, limped, or crawled. Some clutched their coats tight against the knives of wind. Others had none at all and wrapped themselves in rags torn from abandoned wagons. The frost did not forgive. The cold was not merely air, it was an enemy, invisible yet more merciless than any soldier with a musket. Through this wasteland, Napoleon's Arabian horse pressed forward, his hooves striking frozen ground with dull, heavy thuds. The silver sheen of his coat was no longer bright, but matted with sweat that turned to ice in the bitter air. Steam curled from his nostrils, each breath a cloud against the endless white. Yet still he moved. Where stronger and larger horses had collapsed, their bodies lying stiff in the snow, the Arabian endured, step by patient step, carrying his master through the storm. Around them, the army crumbled. Cannons were left behind, their wheels frozen fast to the earth. Wagons full of supplies had been abandoned when horses dropped dead in their traces. The road westward was littered with the dead. Soldiers curled as though sleeping, their faces pale masks beneath a blanket of frost, horses stiff with eyes wide open, tails frozen to the ground. Crows followed the column, black shadows against white skies, swooping low when hunger forced them to feed on what lay behind. Napoleon himself was grim, silent. Wrapped in his greatcoat, hat pulled low, he sat hunched upon the Arabian's back, staring forward with the eyes of a man who knew he had gambled with fate and lost. He rarely spoke, But when he did, it was to ask after the men, the supplies, the roads ahead, and still, when his soldiers caught sight of him mounted upon his Arabian, some found strength to continue. They whispered that if the emperor and his horse could endure, perhaps they could too. The Arabian seemed to understand the weight he carried was more than one man. It was the hope of all who followed. His steps were steady even on ice, his ears flicking at every sound, the crack of a distant musket, the groan of wood as wagons shattered, the howl of wolves that prowled the shadows of the column. He moved with the endurance of his desert ancestors, a creature bred for hardship, for heat and hunger, for days when survival was the only victory. In the icy wasteland of Russia, that same blood carried him forward. There were moments when the retreat became chaos. At the crossing of the Berezina River, the army faced disaster. The river, half frozen, cut a cruel barrier across their path, and the Russians closed in from all sides. Bridges were built from scraps of wood and iron, men throwing themselves into the water to hammer beams together while musket balls hissed around them. The Arabian waited on the bank, restless, his hooves stamping the frozen earth as the emperor urged his engineers on. Finally, as the bridge took shape, Napoleon spurred his horse forward. The Arabian stepped onto the planks slick with ice, beneath which the freezing river roared. Soldiers clung to the sides, horses screamed, men drowned beneath the weight of collapsing timbers. Yet the Arabian pressed on, carrying his master across to the other side, unshaken by the madness around him. For those who saw it, the image burned into memory. The small, silver-coated horse bearing the emperor to safety while thousands perished in the river behind. Each day the army grew smaller. Each night the snow seemed deeper. The Arabian's ribs showed through his skin, his once proud mane tangled and rough, yet he would not yield. He picked his way through frozen corpses, through camps where fires had gone out and only silence remained. Sometimes, soldiers too weak to go further reached out to touch the horse's flank as Napoleon rode past, as if some of the animal's strength might pass into them. And though many of those hands soon grew still, the Arabian never slowed. Napoleon's generals noticed the bond more than ever in those days. When the emperor dismounted, the horse would stand close, as if guarding him. When the emperor returned, the Arabian would lower his head slightly, ready to bear the burden again. The two were inseparable, the man who would not admit defeat and the horse who would not stop walking. As December deepened, temperatures dropped lower still. At night, the air froze breath to lips, and men who slept did not wake. Soldiers tore strips of flesh from dead horses to eat, for starvation hollowed their bellies. Fires burned wagon wheels and saddles when no other fuel could be found. And yet the Arabian carried Napoleon on, across lands that seemed endless, through storms that blinded and winds that cut to bone. When at last they crossed back into friendly lands, the once great Grande Armée was a shadow of itself. Of the 600,000 who had marched into Russia, fewer than 1 in 10 remained. But among those who survived, one figure stood unbroken, the Arabian horse who had carried his master from the gates of Moscow to safety. He was no longer the gleaming stallion of earlier campaigns. His flanks were thin, his coat scarred, his eyes hollow from hunger. Yet he still stood, hooves planted firm, head held high, a survivor of a journey that had destroyed an empire. And so, my dear friends, while men perished by the tens of thousands, this Arabian horse endured, and in enduring became more than an animal. He became a symbol of loyalty, of resilience, of survival against the merciless hand of nature. When the shattered remnants of the Grande Armée limped back across the Niemen River in December 1812, Europe gasped in disbelief. An army of 600,000 had gone into Russia, but fewer than 100,000 returned. Men were broken, generals humbled, and the dream of empire lay in ruins. Yet among the survivors was a creature whose endurance had astonished even hardened soldiers. Napoleon's Arabian horse. Thin as a shadow, ribs jutting through his once proud frame, his silver coat dulled by frost and scars, he had nonetheless carried his master across plains of snow, rivers of death, and fields littered with the bodies of men and beasts. He was no longer simply a horse. He was a witness to history, a living monument of loyalty and survival. Soldiers spoke of him with reverence, and word spread quickly. The Emperor's Arabian had returned from Moscow. In the months that followed, Europe trembled as Napoleon gathered what remained of his power. The Arabian, though weakened, still stood faithfully in his stable, groomed and fed with what little could be spared. Whenever the Emperor appeared, the horse would prick his ears and nuzzle his master's hand, as though aware that their bond had been tested and proven unbreakable. For Napoleon, the sight of his loyal mount was both a comfort and a reminder that even in defeat, endurance could carve a path to survival. The Arabian was present at the great battles that followed: Eylau, Tesin, Bautzen, Dresden. Though by then he was often spared the harshest marches, other horses carried the Emperor, but none ever replaced the Arabian in his heart. When Napoleon inspected his troops, the silver-coated stallion would sometimes be brought forth, and the men would cheer, for to them the horse was more than a beast. He was the ghost of Moscow, the companion who had endured where so many had fallen. But history is merciless. In 1814, the Allied armies marched into Paris, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The Arabian stood silently in his stable as the Emperor bid farewell to the Imperial Guard at Fontainebleau. The horse pawed the ground, restless, sensing change in the air. He would not follow his master into exile on Elba, for the journey was long and uncertain. Instead, he remained in France, tended with care, his name whispered like a legend among soldiers who still remembered the snow of Russia. Napoleon returned once more in 1815 for the 100 Days and the final gamble at Waterloo. The Arabian, aged and weary, did not ride into Belgium, for his years of war were behind him. Younger mounts carried the Emperor to his last battlefield, while the Arabian remained behind like a relic of an earlier time. And when the thunder of Waterloo faded, and Napoleon was sent into his second exile on the distant island of St. Helena, the Arabian never saw his master again. Yet the horse's story did not end in silence. In retirement, he became a living reminder of a vanished empire. Visitors came to see him, to marvel that this small Arabian stallion had endured the retreat from Moscow when so many perished. They touched his scarred flanks, looked into his dark eyes, and whispered that within this animal lived the memory of one of history's greatest tragedies. Legends grew around him. Some said that when the wind howled across the fields, the Arabian would stamp his hooves and whinny, as though recalling the blizzards of Russia. Others swore that when cannons thundered in the distance during military parades, he would lift his head proudly, ears flicking, nostrils wide, remembering the roar of battle. He was not just an animal to them. He was a survivor, a companion to destiny, a silent witness to the rise and fall of an empire. The Arabian lived many years after the retreat, longer than most of his kind. His mane turned white with age, his steps grew slower, but his spirit never dimmed. In his later years, he was treated with honor, fed the best grain, and cared for as though he were a nobleman himself. For those who had survived Russia, he was a reminder of endurance in the face of despair, of loyalty that outlasted empires. When at last he died, the Arabian was mourned not as a beast, but as a legend. His remains were preserved, his story retold in books and whispers, his name carried through generations. He became a symbol of the bond between man and animal, of how even in the darkest hours of history, loyalty and endurance could shine brighter than victory itself. And so, my dear friends, the tale of Napoleon's Arabian horse is not merely about a creature who carried his master through battle. It is the story of survival, of resilience, of a bond that endured frost, fire,